Good morning. My name is John Herbst, and I head the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you today, which comes to you from our center and from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. We have with us today Congressman Mike Turner, who is the representative of the 10th District in Ohio, and he is the chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He also serves as the head of the U.S. delegation to NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We are here to talk about intelligence, and it's in the Beyond the SCIF series that's sponsored by the Select Committee. For those who are not Washington nerds, a SCIF is a secure room where people can talk about sensitive subjects. And we will be talking publicly about sensitive subjects, but in a non-confidential way. We have a terrific panel with us today. We have Rebecca Henrich from the Hudson Institute. We have Katie Sendak from SIPA, and we have Ian Brzezinski from the Atlantic Council. One point that's very important. The United States faces a dangerous threat from a marauding superpower, Russia. And we need to deal with this problem directly. And the place to deal with it is in Ukraine, where Moscow is conducting a war full of war crimes. Congressman Turner and much of the leadership in the Congress, both Republican and Democrat, understand how dangerous this is. And so we are delighted to have him with us today to talk about this. He will ask questions of the panelists here with me, and we will take audience questions. And to do audience questions, for those who are here with us, we have a standing mic. For those who are with us virtually, you can go into askac.org to get your questions loaded up. With that, I turn it over to the Congressman. Sir, thank you for joining us.
John, thank you so much, and I want to thank each of our panelists, and I appreciate the Atlantic Council hosting this Beyond the SCIF session of our series. When I was selected to be chairman of the committee, I was given 3 charges by really our conference and the Republicans when they were looking to what needed to occur in the Intelligence Committee. And that was, 1, return the Intelligence Committee back to a national security focus. Now, you'd think that that would not be an assignment that you'd have to do for the Intelligence Committee, but actually we had lost our way, and it's public, it's bipartisan, and people understanding that the committee need to repurpose its focus. Now, the members had not lost their focus, but the committee as a whole was not functioning. And in order to be able to accomplish the first task, we had to do the second task that I was charged with, and that is return the committee to bipartisanship. And for that, I really want to thank Jim Himes, my ranking member, because we both dedicated ourselves to a bipartisan work, as the Atlantic Council has, and each of you have. And that has enhanced our ability to focus again on national security. And the third was to open up the Intelligence Committee, to reach out to the think tank community, the academic community, and also Congress. We became a resource for the rest of Congress, saying that we're going to invite the chair and the ranking members of the other committees into the Intelligence Committee, get them briefings that relate to their portfolio, so that we could enhance their ability to do their legislative tasks and objectives. I think we've done that, and with your assistance in hosting this Beyond the SCIF, you're helping us accomplish that open up aspect, in that we're reaching out to academia, to think tanks. As we look to what we've accomplished this year and what our strategic plan is for next year, your comments, your expertise is being taken into consideration as we formulate what we need to do. Now, certainly Ukraine and Russia are one of the top issues that we see around the world. It's one of those issues, as you were saying, John, that you look to, how do we deal with Russia? How do we deal with the issue that we have atrocities that are occurring in Europe once again? And also, how do we formulate the United States' role? Now, there's a lot of conversations out there, a lot in the media, who are skeptics or want to challenge whether or not the United States has an interest in this. And one of the things that I'm excited about in this forum today is to get each of your perspectives to be able to make that case. Why is this important to the United States? Because certainly I believe that it is, but you can help us in that message so that people can understand, why is this important to the United States? And why don't you start with that one?
All right. Look, it's very simple. Putin is pursuing a revisionist foreign policy, a policy designed, in fact, to undermine American interests, especially in Europe and beyond. The draft treaty that the Kremlin dispatched to NATO in December of 2021 to quote unquote avert the big invasion that Russia subsequently launched in Ukraine, made clear that they want to have serious political influence across the whole space of the former Soviet Union, which happens to include 3 NATO members, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. They also want to have some influence in the space of the former Soviet Empire, meaning the Warsaw Pact nations. That's another half dozen or more NATO members. So if Putin wins his war in Ukraine, we will see major Russian provocations beyond the current provocations in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, and as we're seeing today at the border of a new NATO state, Finland, where the Kremlin has sent thousands of migrants from the Middle East to cross into Finland. So if we don't want to have to deal with a Russian strike on NATO, let's help Ukraine defeat Putin in Ukraine. That is a vital interest of the United States. And for those who don't understand that the 2 great world wars, which led to over 800,000 American dead, World Wars I and World War II, began in Europe. There has been no major war in Europe until this Russian invasion, and that's because NATO was created at the end of World War II. That ensures American security, it ensures American prosperity. So we have a critical interest in Putin's defeat in Ukraine, and to spend $37 billion a year, less than 4% of our defense budget, so that Ukraine can do that, is a great investment, not just in American security, but American prosperity. As President Biden said in his Oval Office speech and in his op-ed a week or 2 ago, if we don't help Ukraine beat Putin in Ukraine, we may have to face the Russians in Poland, which means with American lives.
Rebecca, why is this important to us?
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to just point out, too, that in the spirit of bipartisanship also, the America's Strategic Posture Commission just produced our consensus document. There were 12 of us, 6 appointed by Congress from the Republican side, 6 from the Democrat side. And we got in a SCIF for almost 18 months and looked at all of the threats. And then really it was the threat and the motivation to defend the US-led order that produced this consensus document, which brings us to the topic of conversation today. And one of the findings, of course, was that Russia continues to be a major, top-tier strategic adversary of the United States. One of the myths, I think, that some Americans may have heard in media and have repeated has been that America's support for Ukraine has actually caused Russia and China to be pushed together. But in fact, they have it reversed. That it's been my assessment that Russia, specifically, and Putin, has long desired to undermine the United States in the U.S. system of alliance in Europe, contesting the United States in various parts of the world, but most acutely where the United States has great influence in the NATO alliance in Europe. But it was because of China's rise and China's backing of Putin and the relationship between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin that Putin had the confidence to launch this full-scale invasion in February of 2022. And so I agree with the previous statement that that understanding that is the larger problem, that the United States is right and on strategic sound ground to bolster Ukraine's defense and to enable Ukraine to defend itself, to push Russia out of its territory. And that's the best thing we can do to keep this on the, if you think of this sort of a continuum of conventional regional conflict with an ally versus our top-tier strategic adversary, helping Ukraine to push Russia out, that keeping that on that lower end of the conflict continuum, that serves the U.S. interest so that we don't actually see this escalate horizontally into NATO territory or vertically with Russia crossing the nuclear threshold. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but you actually have to enable Ukraine to seize the initiative, gain the momentum, and push Russia out so that Russia cannot continue to control the escalation of this conflict.
Very good. Catherine, why is this important to the United States?
Well, this is important for the United States for a few reasons, and I think they've been laid out very, very well by John and Rebecca. I think that the global nature of this is also something that gets lost in translation sometimes, which is a win for Russia is a win for China, is a win for other adversaries that we're looking to defeat around the world. I've been calling it the villains club, but if you look at all the actors participating in these conflicts around the world, Iran, China, Russia, and we're seeing the horrifying situation going on in Israel right now with Hamas. Hamas' first visit, after October 7th was to Moscow. Those connections have to be made, and I think from a national security perspective, it's a really important distinction to make where we cannot treat these things isolated, we cannot treat these things in a bubble. Support to Ukraine is support for how we want to govern ourselves and how we want to live our lives throughout Europe and the United States and the West, and pushing that strict interpretation of deciding what you want to be and where you want to be in your country is vitally important, and support to Ukraine is an absolutely critical piece of that.
One exchange I had with an opponent on the issue of Ukraine was get out a map. Because so many people who look at this issue and have a discussion don't really understand the strategic implications of the Black Sea and all the countries that John is talking about that are at risk and threat. But it really goes beyond just geography. Help us understand, as everyone has been contributing, why is this important to us?
Well, to add to my colleagues, let me first say, Chairman Kimmer, thank you for hosting us today. And thank you for bringing the HERC out to the American public. It's incredibly invaluable, so I salute you for that. Why is this important? At risk of being a little bit redundant to my colleagues, I'd say there are three key issues at stake here. The first is a phrase that many people don't like, but it's the rules-based international order. We have Russia basically, without any provocation, without any justification, invading another country. This is a violation of the principle of sovereignty. This is a violation of the rules, regulations, and principles that have been the basis for peace and prosperity throughout the globe over the last 70 years. When Russia runs roughshod over it and there's a strong response, we can expect others to do the same. And as John pointed out, Putin will not stop with Ukraine. He will go on. And to get down to brass tacks in terms of what this means for the United States, if he goes beyond, he'll be going into another NATO nation, perhaps the Baltics. And then we will be drawn into the war in a direct way. That will be far more costly in terms of our own human sacrifice. It will be cataclysmic, potentially, for the security of Europe and beyond. And then, of course, there are the lessons that others are learning. China is watching very carefully what Russia is getting away with in Ukraine. And it is measuring that against its aspirations regarding Taiwan. So what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. The second factor at stake is a moral issue. Putin isn't just grabbing territory. He's trying to literally rewrite Ukrainian identity, rewrite Ukrainian history. He's trying to impose his vision of what that people is. We haven't seen an action like that since World War II, and it is genocidal. We have a moral obligation, a moral imperative to support the Ukrainians. And then third, NATO's reputation at stake. I don't buy the argument that because Ukraine isn't a NATO member, NATO doesn't get affected by this conflict. It's affected by the security implications. It's a potential to expand. Its credibility among allied members is at stake. Remember, Ukraine contributed to NATO operations in the Balkans and contributed to U.S. operations elsewhere in the world. NATO has embraced formally Ukraine's aspirations for membership. For the alliance to think that this war doesn't have an effect on its standing among its own members and among its adversaries would be gravely mistaken. So NATO's reputation is at stake.
Rebecca, I'm going to start with you next. We're not losing the West in Ukraine, but we're not winning. Tell us some of the things that we've gotten wrong in supporting Ukraine. What do we need to be doing differently?
Well, I think fundamentally, the United States, starting off with sort of the big picture, over many decades, both Republican and Democratic administrations has hoped for a Russia reset, has hoped that we can invite Russia into the West and the U.S.-led order, however you want to characterize that. And so I have to say that point first because I think that we still have some hangover effect of this thinking. And that was the Bush administration, it was the Obama administration, clear the way all the way up through to our current administration. And so I think when Russia was mobilizing its massive number of forces on Ukraine's border, there was still a belief on the side of our country that we could convince Putin not to invade. That if we didn't provide Ukraine sufficient weapons, that we wouldn't provoke Russia, that we wouldn't feed this paranoia that Putin has that Ukraine erroneously poses a threat to Russia. And so because of that wrong idea, the aid was delayed. It's insufficient. And it's been that way throughout the entire war. Fundamentally, the United States, our executive branch from the White House, has not been determined to enable Ukraine to prevail. That has to happen first. Then you develop a strategy. Then you resource that strategy. That has not happened, and so it's really been Congress, and thanks in part to your leadership and the House Armed Services Committee and the other national security committees that have worked in a bipartisan manner to force the administration to provide ATACMS, to provide HIMARS, to provide DPICMs, all these different weapon systems that Ukraine has been asking for all along. But it should have happened from the beginning of the war to help Ukraine again seize the initiative and push Russia out of its territory, and the initial beginning aspect of the war.
Rebecca, you're absolutely right. The word that the administration keeps using is a fear of being provocative versus a fear of not being successful in being able to hold Russia back. Catherine, what are we getting wrong?
Well, it's really interesting because I think the conversation has definitely shifted, over the course of the summer as we see the counteroffensive, which we knew would be very difficult. We knew would be a slog and maybe not be as successful as some had hoped watching this conflict unfold. I think what's interesting at this point, to Rebecca's point, the narrative and some of the messaging surrounding U.S. and Western support about this becoming a forever war, about this getting into a war of attrition, it almost feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point, because the cycle becomes, look how successful Ukraine was against Russia in the first year of the war, their ability to liberate sections of occupied territory. We are counting on the counteroffensive to make great gains in that respect. We have given them things, but look how successful they are, so maybe we don't need to give them as much or as many things or as high-tech things. Then we see the counteroffensive unfold. It is as slow and painful as we had feared. And now the conversation is, well, if they're not going to be successful, why are we giving further assistance and more things to Ukraine? And we're almost fulfilling that self-prophecy because we're not taking into account, to Rebecca's point, at the get, what do they need for victory? What do they need to win? If these timelines had been shifted, would there be a difference on the battlefield a year ago or 6 months ago? And no one knows the answer to that. But as we look forward, the perception has to be Ukraine needs what it needs for victory and not necessarily what we decide to debate on from day to day.
Ian, what do we need to do better?
I think there are 5 things that we need to be doing. First and foremost, we need to embrace categorically, with clarity and with determination, Ukraine's war objectives, which is total territorial reconstitution. That signal hasn't come from the West. It hasn't come from Washington. It hasn't come from President Biden. It needs to be said. It needs to be said to reassure the Ukrainians, and it needs to be said to remind Putin what he's up against. Second, this is an old story, but we need to give the Ukrainians the weapons they need, with the capabilities they need, at the mass they need, and the speed they need, so that they can win this war, not only on their terms, but quickly. Third, we need to really amp up economic sanctions of Russia. Russia's projected to have another year of growth. Our sanctions are nowhere near as severe as we put on Iran, for example. In 2018, when the United States imposed sanctions on Iran, I think the economy dropped within 3 months by 4 to 5%. Its output of oil went from roughly, I think, it dropped to practically 10% of its original output. That's dramatic. We're not seeing that on Russia. So we're in effect enabling, and sometimes we're actually contributing to the financing of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Third, we need to engage the Russian people. We need to have a real strategy of engagement, of public information, to inform the Russian people what actually their government is doing. That is absolutely essential. And then finally, I would say we need to put Ukraine onto a clear path to NATO membership. I would even argue that it should be part of the win strategy in addition to the strategy to secure the stability and whatever peace that follows. It's a part of the win strategy because the only thing that Putin respects and understands is NATO's Article 5. And only after he sees it being imposed or extended to Ukrainian territory today will he recognize he can't win this war. And it's, of course, key to ensuring the peace that follows the war. That's, to me, are the key elements of a win strategy for Ukraine.
And that's a great deal of clarity. John?
I think almost everything has been covered, so I'll just make a broad point. First, we need to define the national security danger to the United States, which is, again, a marauding nuclear superpower who needs to be stopped. Secondly, we need to understand that our desire not to be provocative is the most provocative thing we could possibly do. So when we say, well, we can't send stronger weapons, more powerful weapons to Ukraine because Moscow might escalate, we're telling Putin that we are the feckless leaders that he claims that we are. He cannot win materially. The United States, NATO, and our friends and partners around the world are far stronger in every measure of power than Russia and even China together. What they count on is weak leadership. And sadly, they saw that weak leadership when they invaded Georgia in 2008, when they took Crimea in 2014. And I wouldn't say our leadership now is weak. Our leadership wavers between elements of strength and elements of weakness. And they push hard to reinforce those elements of leadership. And every time a senior administration official says, we can't do X, for example, send ATACMS with a range of 300 kilometers, or establish a naval zone in the Black Sea so supplies can get to and from Ukraine, we are signaling weakness to the Kremlin. That has to stop yesterday. We do those, we define the threat properly, we demonstrate we are going to be moving forward with this, working on our strategic interests. Putin has no alternative but to step back.
Very good, very good. Catherine. So the debate in Congress is, do we continue support and funding? But inherent in that debate is the issue of the end state. How do we define success? Now, if you looked at Putin's tanks stacked up on the road on their way into Kyiv, you'd think we've been pretty successful because on that day, I mean, there was still DOD predicting that Ukraine was going to fall in a matter of hours. And the fact that we're even on an offensive, the fact that Ukraine isn't on the defensive, is a shift in the entire game. We're our own self-critics so many times where we redefine our goals and objectives and don't understand the successes that we're achieving. How do you think we should define success? Because that is part of the debate. And when people look at, do we continue funding for supporting Ukraine in, against the Russian aggression?
You know, that's a great question, and I think it's evolved since February 2022 in terms of how we want to present this message. And I think that, for success for the U.S., I think is clear, consistent funding and messaging, that we are leading this effort from the West. We are looking at it as something that is not a negotiable for victory and for success. I think the way we define victory up until this point has been, what does Ukraine define as victory? When do they foresee and what do they want to achieve in the ability to liberate territory, I should say, and have its borders back to where they were? I believe that is the ultimate success, and I believe that's something that we should ultimately strive for. But I think as the U.S., I understand, what does that look like for us? What are those strategies? And I know that's something that Ukraine's working on. I know that's something that they're working on with their partners in the West about what these things could look like. I think for success for the U.S. is deterring Russia. And I think if we look at Russia and Russia's actions, even internally, to Ian's point about not only their economy, their 2024 defense budget is triple the amount. I believe it's 30% of their overall government budget. They're not going anywhere, and they're counting on the fact that we may. And they're looking at the situation on the battlefield, and they say, we can be here for a while, and we can wait out the West and what could potentially become a war fatigue scenario. I think we have to look at that, and we have to look at it for what it is, which is Russia is currently not being deterred to change any of its actions and stay the course. And we need to think about actions that get us to that deterrence.
Ian, as we look at this, we're not fighting this war. We're supporting Ukraine that's fighting this conflict. How do we, as a party that's supporting someone defending themselves, how do we define success?
I would define success in three ways. One, We want Ukraine to regain its territories, territorial reconstitution. That's an important principle, because if Russia walks away from this war with 1 inch of Ukrainian territory, it will be a win for aggression. It will be a win for revanchism. It will be a signal to others who are adversaries to pursue similar objectives. So one, territorial reconstitution. Second, we want a security architecture to emerge from this war that it ensures enduring stability and peace in Europe, or minimizes the prospect of another invasion like this. For me, that is NATO membership. That's what the Ukrainians want. I think that's the most effective way to ensure long-term stability on the continent. I also think it's part of the win strategy in the war, because membership is how you communicate to Russia. There is no gray zone. Ukraine is not an option to be taken. And then third, speed. I'm a little bit worried about what the impact of an enduring conflict is. It only grinds down on our resource and our allies' resources. It keeps Europe focused inward on its own continent, makes it less able to work with us against other global challenges. And I would argue a Russian win, or also a perpetuation of this war, encourages aggression by others. We're already getting whiffs of this. I have a growing fear that around the world there's an increasing perception that the United States and its allies no longer has the will to fight. We can be deterred. We can be worn down. And it's not surprising me in the context of this war we see in Ukraine, this brutal war in Ukraine. We're now seeing a flare-up of violence in the Middle East, and we're seeing increasing tension, if not aggression, in the Indo-Pacific. So we have a real urgency to putting this war to an end on Ukraine's terms, on the terms of international sovereignty, and to do so quickly.
John, Putin has a vote in all this. How do we define success at the same time that Putin has his own goals and objectives and success he's seeking?
Putin has had, at this point, only limited success with this invasion. The fact that Finland is now a member of NATO and Sweden is going to become a member of NATO already ensured strategic defeat for Putin, which is recognized by others in Russia, although Putin still retains a pretty firm hand on the society. But Ian is right that if, in fact, we were out of strategic fecklessness to enable a negotiation which gives Putin permanent control, semi-permanent control of a large swath of Ukrainian territory, he will declare victory, and that will be perceived as victory not just in Russia, but amongst the bad guys around the world. So defeating him decisively is absolutely key to deterring Xi from moving on Taiwan. By the way, you know, we talk about confusion in the public debate in the United States about the war in Ukraine. There's the geopolitically ridiculous argument made that the core interest of the United States is stopping Xi in Taiwan, and the way to do that is to divert resources from Ukraine to Taiwan. The fact that South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan all say you want to stop Xi from moving on Taiwan, defeat Putin in Ukraine, has not seemed to deter naive Americans from thinking this is grand political strategy, when in fact it's a path to disaster. We need to be clear on the danger posed to our interest, first and foremost by this major war Putin's waging on Ukraine, secondly by the alliance of nasty actors, which includes China, and if the place to stop the whole lot of those nasty actors is first and foremost in Ukraine, but also now, over the past 6 or 7 weeks, in Palestine and Israel. Make sure Hamas loses, as sure as we make that Putin loses.
Rebecca, you had a stellar career on Capitol Hill. The members of Congress on Capitol Hill are struggling with this issue as they're being asked for additional funding. What is success? How do you define how members of Congress who are being asked for additional funding should support a strategy of success, and what would that look like?
So when I talk to folks, the first thing I say is I can give you, Rebecca, as an American, from a U.S. perspective, what I would be satisfied with for the outcome of this war. I would be satisfied isn't the totally satisfying word, but what I would consider a success is if we get back to February 2022 borders, and Ukraine is a strong and sovereign nation with an air force and the ability in the military to defend itself, an active participant in the security architecture of Europe, regardless of whether or not it's a NATO member, and that the United States shifts its center of gravity to its focus on NATO's protection towards the east. So it's Poland, the Baltic nations, because that's where the current threat from Russia's further aggression would be. And then that the United States bolsters our own ability to successfully and credibly deter Russia. We mentioned its nuclear weapons many times. I mean, the reason that Russia has been so successful is because it is successfully wielding nuclear brinksmanship. And I think that the administration has been wrong to publicly and so often state its fear of Russia's nuclear employment. The French have been actually much better when Putin initially started threatening nuclear employment. It was the French that reminded, ever so non-discreetly, that NATO is also a nuclear power. When our administration once again did things like stopped its long-planned unarmed ICBM test. I'm saying that we were being a responsible nuclear power. Well, a responsible nuclear power successfully deters nuclear employment. That's what's responsible. And so I think we've been constantly making it easier on Putin to make calculations rather than complicating his calculations, which is what we should be doing. So I would get back to bolstering the credibility of our own deterrence, thinking more seriously about that, making sure that Europe has credible nuclear employment options to successfully deter Russia and make sure that coercion doesn't continue successfully, and then bolster our own defense. Last point I'll make on this, our commander of Northern Command repeatedly has said that Russia still poses an acute threat to the American homeland. Mm-hmm. That is part of what's going on with the risk aversion on the part of this administration, because they know that. So the stronger our own homeland is, the less successful Russia is going to be at convincing the United States not to come to the aid of our allies. So we need to get busy on that.
Rebecca, I want to thank you for your work on the Strategic Posture Review and the fact that you continue to bring that home, because that really is the crux, I believe, of the dichotomy here of what do we do, because Russia is a threat to our homeland. This is not just a conflict that happens in Europe. And to the extent that they're having to focus on their losing conflict in Ukraine, they're not being able to invest in ways that actually continue to threaten our homeland, and they're being incredibly, as the administration's term is, provocative with respect to the United States homeland security.
One more point on that, sir, too. One thing that just gets lost in this is, the United States is very good at making weapons and producing weapons and then successfully carrying out this helping Ukraine fight this war against Russia. We have just got a couple of decades of fighting the global war on terror. This is the first time that we're actually getting to test out our weapons on a major power. And so we're learning so much with how the Ukrainians have been able to successfully push the Russians back, how our weapons are actually performing. We're keeping track of how these weapons are performing. So, undermining this myth that we don't even know where all of our weapons are. To the contrary, we're keeping close tabs on them through the polls' help and assistance as well. And all of that is benefiting the United States and forcing the Department of Defense, which is often very slow to make changes, to reboot its production lines in Ohio and in Arizona and Iowa and Kansas and Arkansas to produce the necessary weapons at the scale we need in order to deter a major power conflict with either Russia or China.
So that was a great transition, Ian, because that's exactly what the point I was going to make to you next, to ask for your insights. We have to look, as we're still in this conflict, but it's been going on for long enough that we can begin the process of saying, what are the lessons that we've learned? One lesson that we learned is that Russia's military was not all it was cracked up to be. It turned out to not be the great power that people had thought of its land forces. Secondly, as Rebecca was just making the case, we got to find out that our weapons are pretty extraordinary, that we had great capabilities that could easily be transferred to another country, and that they had the ability to come up to speed and scale to be able to put them on target. And third, we learned the importance of our intelligence gathering, which of course is the area that I work on most in Congress, and that using that intelligence in ways both in sharing it with our ally to the detriment of our adversary, is important and significantly has an impact on the battlefield. But also, secondly, in that aspect, making that intelligence public could have an impact on the outcome of what our adversary is going to do by calling them out, by saying we know what you're planning, by letting everyone know what in fact their plans are, that we can impact those. In fact, it's been publicly stated that when Prigozhin and the Wagner group was ready to drive into Moscow, we may have known more about what they were doing than Putin did. So there is a great understanding of our own capabilities that we've not had before. What are some of the things that you look at that you think are incredibly important that we need to say, these are lessons learned that we need to work on more, or that we need to fix, or that we should celebrate?
I would say one lesson that you didn't mention is we learned a lesson on the Ukrainians and how determined they are, how courageous they are, how tenacious they are when it comes down to defending their sovereignty, their democracy, and ultimately our own interests. So that's a lesson that I have to say I even underestimated them in this case. I think another lesson Rebecca hit on is the danger of nuclear coercion. We haven't seen nuclear coercion, which is a key element of Putin's strategy to defeat Ukraine by keeping the West from supporting Ukraine. He's had some impact. We haven't seen this kind of exercise since the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were able to push back against that. We're in a position now where the risk of nuclear coercion being successful is a real threat. And that will have relevance not only for European security, but for elsewhere around the world. Think of the lessons that Xi is taking from this. How will he incorporate nuclear weapons in any strategy he has to retake Taiwan? That's a dangerous possibility. There are countries out there that are pursuing nuclear weapons and will probably look at this war, and right now seeing nuclear coercion working, be even more energized to acquire those weapons. And there's some even our own allies, like South Korea, having a very lively debate on whether or not they should go nuclear. This is a lesson that we haven't quite formally developed conclusions on, but it's definitely something that we have to watch. I think another lesson is speed of response. When you allow a situation to fester or to continue to burn along, when you have the capability to decisively end it, you end up paying a price. We're ending up paying a price today. We've seen an important partner, I would say de facto ally, be worn down by the Russians. By not acting decisively in support of the Ukrainians, we've emboldened Putin, increased his determination, and we've worn down our own stocks in a way that's a little bit dangerous. So those are kind of three key lessons I draw from this conflict.
John, lessons learned.
I think that, again, we've heard probably all the lessons we can gather from this by my colleagues. I would just reinforce the importance of a stronger and integrated American response as the leadership at NATO across the board. What that means is, picking up on Ian's last point, we need to do more in weapons production than we have. If we treated the national security dangers of this war and possible war in the Pacific, for example, the way we treated COVID, far more weapons lines production would have been opened up by now. We have not done that. So there are shortages right now, especially with ammunition, which should not be. 19 or 20 months since Russia's big invasion began. We need the stronger nuclear posture back, because we've never had in American history before this big invasion senior American officials saying we can't do X, Y, or Z because the other guy may go nuclear. We need to have clarity also within NATO about the Russian danger. There's no reason why the arrangement we put in with Russia from the late 90s still exists. That shows the hope in parts of the alliance to somehow get back to business as usual with an aggressive Kremlin. And actually, last point, returning to the nuclear issue. We have seen numerous reports, and I'll bet you in your classified capacities even a lot more than I've seen in the public sphere, of China doubling down on its desire to become a pure nuclear power by 2030 or so, as a result of watching us being intimidated by Russia with nukes. That's a very serious problem for us, which we are creating.
Before I go to Rebecca, I want to remind the audience and those who are viewing the opportunity to ask questions, and please can submit those so that we can turn to them. Rebecca, in asking you lessons learned, I know you've got thoughts on that, but I want to give you a subcategory of that once you get done with your thoughts. please speak for a minute, and with your background, you certainly can comment on the issue of missile defense. Everybody keeps saying that Ukraine needs air defense systems. You know, we've been reticent and even slow in developing and propagating air defense systems, but also missile defense with respect to, as Ian was talking about, and John has mentioned, and you certainly in your strategic posture review speak about the Russian threat. If we actually had implemented missile defense systems, we do change the dynamics, and we do deter an adversary who could be threatening us. What are your thoughts on what we should be learning?
Absolutely, we're going to need another panel discussion. So we have seen in real time the clear battlefield use of defenses. And so we've seen this with Ukraine. We see this with Israel, obviously. The United States, again, back to that false assumption that the United States has held for many decades, that Russia was no longer a threat. The missile defense system that we have for the U.S. homeland is limited so that it only protects the United States homeland against rogue state actors, primarily North Korea, and then if Iran were to get a credible ICBM. And so one of our recommendations from the Strategic Posture Commission actually has been that we have to just further adapt our homeland defense system to take away the coercive threat from peers, China and Russia. What we mean by that is, what are the things that the Russians and the Chinese would want to hold at risk against the United States that would enrage us, that would paralyze us but not enrage us? So an attack against the United States that would not necessarily elicit a massive response for fear of escalation, but could cause the United States and the American people to say, this is not worth it. Coming to the aid of Taiwan is not worth it. Coming to the aid of Latvia is not worth it, or Lithuania. And it's a real problem, because even if they're wrong on that, you're still now on the course of a serious war now with a major nuclear power. And so one of our recommendations is we have to take away that temptation of the coercive threat. And so we have to bolster and further adapt U.S. missile defenses to defend against what the Chinese and the Russians would do. And that further bolsters the credibility of our deterrence, because it causes the Russians and the Chinese to say, we're going to have to go even bigger to do this if we're going to actually hit the U.S. homeland, because of our doubts of a successful attack. And so back to another theme that we've mentioned several times here is the administration really has to shift from, rather than constantly trying to allay the fears of Putin that the United States isn't going to do this or that, we should be causing him to be fearful of what the United States is able to do and willing to do to defend Ukraine, defend our allies, and that makes it much harder for him to make calculations. And then other thing on just lessons learned, if I can too, it really is no kidding the importance of allies. And so this is not just an academic discussion. I mean, this is a real no kidding thing that our allies right now, as we enter this Cold War, which I agree with, is really it's China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran versus the United States-led system of alliances in the Western societies, is that we need them. We need them for intelligence cooperation. We need them for technology sharing. We know that from AUKUS. I mean, we can't just do it ourselves. And so to the extent that we can listen to see how the Estonians are so good at cybersecurity, how the other Baltic nations are just so good at countering gray zone warfare and information warfare, that helps the United States of America. And I think that's certainly a lesson we've learned.
Catherine, before we turn to question and answers from the audience, what have we learned?
So obviously, my colleagues have covered a lot of ground. I think there's a couple of things, as we look at our own defense industrial base challenges, as we're seeing out of this conflict. I think that's a huge wake-up moment, not just for the United States, but for the West. I am very encouraged to see the just-in-time moving away to just-in-case. And I think that's a critical aspect as we look at this, and that gets to the point, we can't do this without allies and partners. And I think that cognizance as we approach these industrial-based challenges is huge. The other side of that coin is the defense technology and innovation we're seeing out of the battlefield in Ukraine. I think that's going to have long-standing effects on how we address some things that we want to approach in a conflict. What we're seeing is trench warfare and 21st century technology meeting in the middle. How we approach conflict, conventional conflict and unconventional conflict in the future is going to be hugely based on lessons learned that we're learning in Ukraine and on the battlefield. And I think that as we look at the future of warfare, what that's going to look like, and the resilience of the Ukrainian people to take 80 different systems from 30 different partners and be able to cobble that together into a cohesive structure as they approach their enemy is remarkable.
Excellent, excellent. You certainly have proven the importance of your background and expertise as a panel, and now we'll turn to the question and answer from the audience. Do we have a question?
Good morning, and thank you very much. For you, Mr. Chairman, I have a question about how come we view the many wars that are going on right now in isolation. So why is there not more connectivity between what's going on in the East Med, through the Bosporus, into the Black Sea, and up the Danube? Why are we not talking about what this means for energy security for a substantial part of the world? Why are we not talking about the freedom of navigation issues? And why are we not drawing the linkages between Russia, Iran, and the rest of the world? Because let's face it, Russia's been supplying Hezbollah and Hamas for over 40 years. So why are we not making that connection? And why are we tending to look at funding and everything in isolation? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question, and by asking the question, you certainly make the case. They really are all connected. And I think this is one of the frustrations that you see on Capitol Hill with respect to this administration's policy, because they're not making that case. And they continue to discuss them as if, if we just hold back Russia and Ukraine, we've saved Ukraine. But it's not. It's beyond that, as you're making the point. If we just support Israel with respect to Hamas, then we're going to solve the Middle East issues and Iran. That's not the case. I mean, you have to look at the root of where these conflicts are coming from, and certainly, as you've made the point, of the connectivity between them. These are all adversaries. This is, I think the most important moment that we missed in our national security discussion was when President Xi went to Moscow and stood next to Putin and said to him, it was like an open mic, hot mic moment that was caught, that President Xi said, we, the collective, the two of them, are bringing about change that has not happened for 100 years. Well, we know what that 100 years is. That 100 years is World War I and World War II. And what was that battle? That was between authoritarianism and democracy. And they see themselves as leading a worldwide battle to overturn that conflict between authoritarianism and democracy. If we don't see this as a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, as that connectivity that you were making the case of with Israel, with Iran, with Taiwan and China, with Ukraine and Russia and all of their aggression, we will miss the real conflict that the two of them are celebrating.
Can I?
Please.
Yeah. We need a grand strategy. I mean, we're not thinking about this in terms of grand strategy. I mean, one of the things I tell people who say that, our efforts to support Ukraine are taking away our efforts to even handle the Iranian problem or the China problem, I say, listen, if you are primarily concerned about Iranian support for proxies abroad and the Iranian ability and willingness to spread instability across the region, you should support Ukraine's ability to take out the IRGC drone training bases in Crimea. You should support, these are connected. You should not support folks who argue that we need to continue to give the Iranian government increased sanctions relief. You're supporting the Russian war machine, the more money that you give the Iran regime, because they're directly supporting Russia's war against Ukraine. And then you could go on and see where it was a Chinese flagged, Hong Kong flagged ship that was sailing aside a Russian flagged ship at around the same time that an undersea cable was just cut in the Baltics. So you can connect the dots if you're willing to do it and see them. So I appreciate the question, and it really gets back to what the chairman just said. We really need a grand strategy to see how these major actors are behaving and then how the rogue states are being exploited to their advantage. And the last point, too, the U.S. is a coalescing force. That's the other big lesson here. Our allies are willing to do so much when the United States pushes, and I do not believe in this idea that the United States pushes too hard and supports the Poles, the Baltic countries, and the Brits in their willingness to help Ukraine prevail, that we lose the support of the Germans. I think playing both sides is really just it's really kind of holding us back, so that the country that's the least willingness to do more is the one that sort of takes the cake for what NATO does. So I think that the United States leads and pushes for this greater effort. Our alliances will come along with us.
John and then Ian.
Rebecca made the point that I wanted to make, so I'll just amplify it a little bit. You have had no great power war since World War II because of U.S. leadership, first and foremost in Europe, the Far East, and globally. U.S. leadership will move even the more timid allies, in this case Germany, in the necessary direction. You mentioned the moment when Xi and Putin were in Moscow celebrating the new world they were going to create. Amazingly, if you look at their past behavior, the one country, the one leader who understood that was in Tokyo. Because what happened? While they were celebrating in Moscow the new order, he went to Ukraine to demonstrate his solidarity, to make the point that this was the place to stop the marching authoritarians. Sadly, what we've seen since the big invasion and even before it is American leadership making partnership with the weakest chink in the NATO lane, meaning Germany. And that's what's held us back. There's no doubt that if we pursued a bolder leadership, we worked with our allies who understand the need for that leadership, meaning in the first instance, the Brits, the Germans would come along. The so-called realists in the United States like to quote John Quincy Adams that we don't go abroad to slay monsters. What they fail to recognize is that John Quincy Adams also was responsible for the Monroe Doctrine. And he said famously at the time, regarding possible European intervention in the Western Hemisphere, we do not want to be the dinghy in the wake of the British man-o'-war. So he issued the Monroe Doctrine. What we've seen right now is with the United States, easily the most powerful country in the world, following reluctantly the strategic lead of our British friends, instead of being in lead with them. And that is just a very sad situation and unnecessary.
Ian?
You know, the question highlighted the connectivity between Russia and Iran and China and these terrorist groups. That connectivity underscores the urgency with which we need to pursue victory in Ukraine quickly, because that connectivity resonates victory to these adversaries. When you vacillate, when you procrastinate, when you're intimidated by nuclear coercion, that also resonates very quickly among these different adversaries. That's why Ukraine, it's so important to win Ukraine quickly, fastly, and on terms the Ukrainians have put out. And then I would second my colleagues on U.S. leadership. U.S. leadership right now has been impaired by two things. One, this is on Ukraine, an exaggerated perception of risk of escalation. And second, an exaggerated fear of the weakness of alliance consensus.
Yeah.
And there's a lot more the United States could do with a core set of countries. Think of the UK, think of the Netherlands, think of Denmark, think of France, think of those 11 or 12 Central European countries. They're willing to do more to act decisively in support of Ukraine. And that's more than enough of consensus to pull the rest of Europe along, including Germany, because I'm convinced Germany will do everything the United States does.
Excellent. Question?
Hi, Doug Klain. I'm with Rosam for Ukraine and a fellow here at the Atlantic Council. I want to ask about supplemental aid for Ukraine. Right now, that's the most important fight in Washington to help Ukraine to get supplemental aid passed in Congress. Leaders on the Hill are optimistic that this will get done, but at the same time, reporters covering the Hill say that this is the last train leaving the station on new aid for Ukraine, and that new aid is unlikely to happen next year. So my question is, what does it mean for America's credibility with our allies? And more importantly, what does it mean for Ukraine if new aid is not continued next year?
Well, I'll give my crystal ball prediction on this after you all contributed to what kind of message is it sending?
This clearly sends a message of weakness. And just so we're reminded of that, Putin made a statement, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, as he watched this chaos, that Western aid to Ukraine stops, we win the war in a week. That was an overstatement, but it speaks to a harsh reality. Ukraine will win this war as long as American support is not diminished. I think the administration's policy on arming Ukraine has been too timid against our own interest, but it has been adequate to prevent a Russian victory, and over time, even continuing just this will lead to a Ukrainian victory. But if this aid ceases, Ukraine may well go down in defeat, and this will be a disaster, obviously, for the Ukrainian people, but also for American interests. We may wind up fighting the Russians in Estonia.
Catherine?
If I may, so thank you so much for the question. And, I think it's really clear. I think the supplemental, the way it is right now, would provide Ukraine assistance for upwards of a year, meaning Congress would not have to continue to have this conversation, and we could have clear, consistent funding, clear, consistent messaging, not just to the U.S., to our allies and partners, also looking to see what they'd like to do, to Russia, in terms of our strength and our resolve to continue to support Ukraine in their efforts. And I think it gets to the point that was just made earlier. Our allies and partners don't need to be pushed for U.S. leadership. They crave it in many instances. And when we put it out there, they will do it. And so I think it's a really important aspect that we set the tone. And supplemental funding like this and these conversations and strong support, congressional support, Congress has so much power to project that message forward. I think it's absolutely critical that it gets passed, and I think U.S. leadership is craved around the world on this.
Well, now to my prediction. There's the problem with the Ukraine funding is it's severalfold, and largely it's part of the issues that we've been discussing here, and that is the failure of the administration to articulate a plan of success. So in Congress, people are debating, what are we going to do? How do we achieve the goals and objectives, or what are our goals and objectives? Secondly, and I've had this conversation with President Zelensky, the administration in their last Ukraine funding bill overloaded funding on the humanitarian side that didn't even go to Ukraine. So Zelensky is saddled with this perception of the American people of billions of dollars that have never even gone to Ukraine, that actually were used by the administration to go around the world. On the military aid side, not only is it money that we've accounted for and that we understand where it's going, and that it's proven that it has been essential and has been successful, but you have that also saddled with the administration's reluctance, based on this concept of provocativeness, of giving Ukraine what it needs to be able to win. We were talking earlier, it's like the administration has to say no to Ukraine publicly 3 times for every weapon system before it finally admits and gives it to them, and then it takes 6 more months to get it to them. And this is a conflict and war now that needs expedited support. So, but in this particular package, you've got the quad that the administration has put forward, which is Ukraine, Israel, Asia, people say Asia / Taiwan, and then the southern border. The real sticking point is that the administration is unwilling to accept the failure of its southern border policy and really do policy negotiations with Congress. This is not an issue of just funding for the southern border. You have to change policy issues, and that's going to be the holdup. That's why I think we're not going to be able to get it done by the end of the year. It'd be great if we could, but I don't think the administration's willing yet to concede that their southern border policy is a failure, and it's going to have to be addressed in this package. If they came to the table, if they recognized what obviously is in every poll that the American public sees as a absolute failure of their southern border policy, and worked with Congress to address it, then I think this moves quickly. Anyone want to contribute on that? Next question.
Hello, my name is Benton Koblenz. I'm an employee here at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and I actually have the distinct pleasure of asking a couple of questions on behalf of our virtual audience. So first off, an anonymous question, which asks, how do you gauge Europe's support for Ukraine? Are Europe's contributions, which according to the Kiel Institute lead in terms of money committed to Kyiv, are those contributions getting enough focus in the conversation here in Washington? And I'll give you a double hitter as well, with another anonymous question that asks, what needs to happen at the next NATO summit in Washington in 2024 to continue Ukraine's integration into Western institutions?
John, I'll start with you. I know you on the second part, you have very strong opinions.
Okay. On question 2, I think that the outcome of the Vilnius summit was disappointing. I think that we barely moved in Vilnius beyond the previous summit. And you could even argue we barely moved since the Bucharest summit in 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest 2008. I agree with Ian that we need a stronger signal within the NATO framework to Moscow that, in fact, Ukraine is going to become a member. Because I don't think the statement in abstract that was made in Bucharest, again, now we're talking 15 years ago, is taken all that seriously. if you go back and look at the history of that summit, you'll see that the Bush administration pushed hard for a membership action plan. Germany and France said no, and that was the consolation prize. Which why, by the way, those who argue that provocation of Ukraine possibly joining NATO and Georgia possibly joining NATO in 2008 led to Moscow's war on Georgia and then the war on Ukraine is completely wrong. Because everybody understood that Bucharest was a defeat for membership for those two countries. In any case, so I think that it is extremely difficult right now to actually offer Ukraine invitation to NATO because of what that means for Article 5. But I think we can take a step towards that, and it's not just me, Ian and I think Katie as well, and others, 45, 50 former national security officials have argued for something called an invitation for an accession membership talks for Ukraine. This does not guarantee membership, but it moves us closer to that. I think that is a clear signal of intent, which Moscow will understand of greater strength and greater support for Ukraine from the West, including NATO, without saddling us with all the ambiguities of actually having Ukraine join while the war continues. That's what I think we should do on that.
Our allies' contribution to Ukraine and NATO summit.
Yeah, I'll take the first one and say that I was just in Vilnius before the summit, actually meeting with the Lithuanians and then some of the other Baltic countries and hearing how they're thinking about the war, et cetera. I mean, these countries have contributed enormously as a percentage just of GDP, but also in terms of, I mean, some of these countries, in the case of, I think, Estonia and Lithuania, probably Latvia, but definitely those two, have almost emptied their own stocks to give it all to Ukraine. And so they're faced with a situation where if the United States ends its supply of weapons to Ukraine, which, by the way, another misunderstanding, in addition to the one you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, about how so much of this humanitarian aid isn't even getting directly to Ukraine. And there's another misunderstanding that a lot of the aid that's in these packages strictly goes to Ukraine, but it's actually resupplying our own stocks. And so if we stop doing that, we were not resupplying our own stocks, and then we're not able to resupply that of our allies as well. And so they need, our allies need to know that the United States, again, is going to maintain a leadership role here and be a coalescing force. But all of those, the Baltic countries, the Poles, the Brits, they've contributed significantly. And then we haven't even talked about, in the initial part of the war, I mean, Poland, I visited Warsaw, and you walk out of your hotel and all you saw was women and children, and they were Ukrainians. Because Poland took in immediately the women and children who were evacuating the war zone. So our allies have done more. Germany has actually contributed a significant amount. Of course, they're promising more than they're delivering, and so there's a lot there that they can do. But I wouldn't just look at the sheer amount of money. I would see what it is that they're actually doing. Again, because different countries can contribute different things. But it is a significant part of the conversation that I think that our government could do a much better job at messaging.
That's right, because in aggregate, our allies have actually contributed more than we have.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
Catherine?
absolutely. That was the statistic that came to mind. I believe it's something that we are, as part of GDP, I think we are 29th, something like that, of contributions to Ukraine assistance. I think that message isn't getting translated in DC very well. Whenever I have the opportunity to sit down with colleagues in embassies and foreign governments throughout Europe and the West, I encourage them to go up to the Hill and to go around and spread that message. And there's an education piece of what everyone is providing for Ukraine. It gets back to the earlier point. We can't do this alone, nor should we. And I think Europe and many European nations realize that and are doing a tremendous amount. It's getting that translation to where it needs to go and confronting some of those arguments that aren't factual.
Ian?
Sir, I'd basically reiterate my colleagues say regarding our European allies and their contributions. They've been enormous. They've matched us, so to speak. The criticism I'd have is that our limitations, our hesitancy to do more for Ukraine is actually probably limiting the willingness of our allies to do more for Ukraine when it comes down to the capabilities we provide, the level of mass that we provide, the restrictions that we impose on the use of that equipment. If we did more in those areas, our European allies would do more in those areas. So it's an opportunity. Regarding NATO membership, I have a slightly different take from John on the Vilnius summit. I actually think it was a near miss. When I look at the summit and its deliberations, I saw an unprecedented number of allies ready to support an invitation to Ukraine. And by my count, there are only 2 countries that were really blocking that actively. That was the United States, followed by Germany, and Germany was doing what the United States did. So it was a near miss. And it ought to motivate the Ukrainians and motivate the advocates of Ukraine to push hard for an invitation at the Washington summit. And I would argue an invitation to the Washington summit should be one that happens and is effectuated quickly, because we can extend Article 5 to Ukraine, to territory that Ukraine controls, and it would be easier to do it now when the Russians are weak. I don't think Russia wants to take on the challenge of NATO. If we extended that umbrella over the territory that Ukraine controls, Russians would not want to really engage us, particularly in the state of their armed forces now. 2 or 3 years from now, as we were talking about, as Russia is reconstituting the forces, it will be more difficult and more dangerous to do so.
We had this conversation before we came out here. I'm actually not an advocate for additional steps toward membership at the next summit. I think what we did in Bucharest is really incredibly strong, saying that they will be a member of NATO. And I do think also that we've been on the path of working with them. They virtually have all aspects of membership action plan in their working. And obviously, with NATO stepping up to the plate with the conflict that they're having in the aggression of Russia, certainly other than boots on the ground, they have all the support with respect to being a strong ally of NATO. I am concerned of setting it up as a failure, that there would be this high bar of what we expect we're going to be able to achieve for Ukraine in the NATO summit, and then not accomplishing it. I think that would be a win for Putin. Obviously, we can't do membership because that would mean they are they can avail themselves of Article 5, and we'll have what we don't have now, which is American boots on the ground in Ukraine. I think we are stepping up, though. I think clearly we have lived up to the Budapest Memorandum of saying we're going to assist on the issue of their territorial integrity, and all the allies are stepping together. Becca, you want to?
Yeah, now that you said it, I've got enough guts now that I'll say what I think too, which is that, and I don't mean to dodge it, it's just one that I feel pretty strongly about, is I just think that there's so much more we can do for Ukraine apart from NATO membership, that by focusing on NATO membership, we're missing all this other effort that I think would be greatly helpful. Ukraine can play an integral part in the security architecture of Europe. One of the things that we have failed to do is permit Ukraine to fight this war as though Ukraine were a member of the NATO alliance. In other words, give it air superiority, give it these big, longer range drones, rush the F-16s, let the ATACMS have their full range and not just limiting their range. Enable Ukraine to fight this war the way we would do it if we were doing it, but give it all the resources to do it. I think that's where our focus should be, and then table this issue until Ukraine is ready to have that conversation.
I could counterpoints, John.
Well, no. I think almost everyone agrees that the single most important thing for us now is to arm Ukraine properly.
Yes.
That to maintain our assistance overall and to arm Ukraine properly. That is job one. That does not mean we can't also have as job two NATO as a signal, again, first and foremost to Putin, that this is coming and you're going to have to eventually back down. And then we can disagree on some of the details, but we all agree weapons is the key.
I'd add just a couple points. One on the readiness of Ukraine. There are only 4 conditions that Ukraine has to meet under Article 10. It has to be a European country, so box checked. 2, it has to stand for the principles that define the alliance, democracy. It's had multiple elections. Not only multiple elections have been free and fair, but they have been burdened by the intervention of the Russians in that. And that's an important point, and it underscores to me that they are really committed to those principles. 3, they need to add value to North Atlantic security, and they're doing that in blood today. And then the 4th, and that's the thing that's missing, is consensus within the alliance. And this is where American leadership comes in. I'm sure you remember, sir, but getting Poland into NATO wasn't a slam dunk. It was a 6 to 7 year effort that was facilitated by U.S. leadership, often pushing our allies in that direction. So it can be done. And when we don't signal that, we're actually sending the wrong message to Putin. And my worry about having a strategy to support Ukraine based solely on weapons, it's not comprehensive enough to give me confidence that will enable the Ukrainians to win quickly enough. That's why I call for a multiple strategy, real economic sanctions on Russia, engaging the Russian people on this war, arming up the Ukrainians, lifting restrictions on weapons, but also communicating to Putin the one thing that he recognizes and understands, and that's NATO's Article 5. That's why he hasn't gone after NATO members like the Baltic states.
One more point here on a signal to Putin. That's why it would be wonderful, this is not going to happen, if in Washington they got rid of the Russia-NATO charter.
Absolutely.
That would be a very clear signal.
One last point, just to bolster something though that Mr. Chairman said about, I do worry though that NATO's inability to make that happen though would be almost devastating. I mean, we're having such a hard time getting Hungary and Turkey to let Sweden on board, and so you know, I'm concerned about what message that would send if you start moving in that direction.
Something needs to be done there too, with those two countries, especially.
We're going to need another hour.
There's also a message you send when you don't endorse it.
Okay.
And that's dangerous too.
See, not always unanimity at the Atlantic Council.
That's very good. So our last question, and then we're going to go to closing comments because we're to the end.
Hello, my name is Olivia. I'm also with the Eurasia Center. And so our final question is from George, and he asks, how do we engage the Global South to better understand the ramifications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example, on food safety? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
All right, I'll jump in. First, I think there is, at this point, a gathering effort, certainly in Ukraine, in Europe, and also in the United States, to try and explain to the Global South the stakes. That should continue. And in fact, we can play on the overreach of the Russians, the overreach also of the Chinese in their imperial adventures in Latin America, in Africa, and also in parts of Asia, where their heavy hand is turning people off to the lure of Chinese, especially money. But let me make another point that's really important. The Global South is the current iteration of what used to be called the non-aligned movement. The non-aligned movement, by its very name, did not take a stand during the Cold War. The collective West defeated the totalitarians in the Cold War. We can defeat Putin in Ukraine, his intention on Taiwan, even if we don't pull the Global South in, but we should still work on it.
I would just say that I think that the Global South, this terminology, you know, this is an emerging area of the world. Pre-Cold War, they are a wealthier section of the globe. You look at Latin America, you look at Africa, you look at Southern Asia. I had the privilege of working on some of these issues in previous jobs. I think engaging them is absolutely critical, and I think the West has ignored some of the issues that this area of the world sees as priorities for a long time because we had other priorities and we had other things that we wanted to do. I think a situation like Ukraine, food safety, the ramifications, the ripple effects of this war in Ukraine to things like grain amplifies the need that we need to engage. U.S. leadership needs to be, unfortunately, everywhere all the time because when we're not there, or fortunately as the case may be, when we're not there, other vacuums of influence take its place.
So what have we missed? Closing comments?
I think we covered a lot of it.
This has been a great discussion.
We covered, I think, everything. I would just like to reiterate that our intervention, our role in Ukraine, our role in the Middle East, our role in East Asia contributes not just to American security, but to American prosperity. And if you are criticizing our global engagement, because we spend X amount of dollars on aid programs and on our military, our presence overseas, you're neglecting the system we created globally, which has, again, made us a far more prosperous and a far more secure country.
Yes.
Allies count.
That was beautifully said, and so I hate to ruin it with my own remarks here, but I do want to make the point that the U.S.-led order directly benefits the American people. I mean, we're in this very heated political environment at home, and so some of these arguments are getting lost. But it is true that American farmers need fertilizer, and so the price of a lot of those commodities comes from Eastern Europe. Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. We think about energy security and the effects of what happens when Iran is threatening to really engaging in piracy with these proxies in the Strait of Hormuz and beyond, or the Houthis. And so all of this gets back to, the security of these regions relies on the United States having a leadership role, working with our allies to create a stable environment and prevent a world in which the Chinese and the Russians and their rogue state actors are able to set the terms. Either you run the show or the show runs you. And so the United States has a significant role to play. The other thing I would just say on the Global South too, the United States needs to get back in the business of demonstrating to other countries that they will be better off when the United States is the preeminent power, not China. And so that means going and meeting needs that they have rather than the United States going in and trying to tell them what specifically their needs are, because China is meeting practical needs. And so we need to understand we are in this rivalry, this competition. So where can we be proactive to demonstrate to these countries that they will be better off if the United States is the preeminent power?
Closing contributions?
I will just quickly say that U.S. leadership, as was said, is absolutely critical. And the more that we can project clear message, clear funding, consistent leadership without and taking out some of this white noise that this town can do very well, will only benefit the U.S. in the long run and will only make it more likely that that Ukraine will be victorious quickly.
Because my final word would be, Ukraine is the first of a series of conflagrations we're seeing across the world today. Our failure to more decisively enable Ukraine to win on its terms and quickly, I would say, has contributed to the catalyst and helped catalyze the violence we're seeing in the Middle East and the increasing assertiveness we're seeing in China in the Indo-Pacific. Ukraine is the most intense conflict of those series. All of them could escalate in ways that could be cataclysmic, very challenging, and very costly to the United States and its military personnel if we don't cap it now. Ukraine needs to win now as the first step to tamp down the rest of these conflicts. Ukraine is the first battle that we have to win, and we have to win decisively.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this in part of the series of Beyond the SCIF from the Intelligence Committee. This helps us gather intelligence and information and contributions from those like you who have great expertise in national security that we can take back as part of our strategic plan as to what we need to be doing in Congress and our committee. I think this is a great discussion concerning Ukraine. I certainly commend it to people who have questions about why we're in Ukraine and what we should be doing. And I want to thank each of you, not just for your contributions in this panel, but for your continuing contributions to the debates on national security issues, because you make a difference and your voices are heard on Capitol Hill, which translates directly into U.S. policy. With that, I want to also thank all of our viewers and those in attendance for participating in this Beyond the SCIF series. So thank you.